On the night of 16 November 1941, 5 aircraft lifted off from an airstrip in Egypt, carrying 65 men who belonged to a unit that had never fought a battle. By the following morning, 22 of them would make it back. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered so far across the Libyan desert that some would spend days simply trying to find their own equipment. That unit was L Detachment, Special Air Service, the earliest form of what would eventually become the SAS. Its first mission, Operation Squatter, is remembered today mainly as the disaster that nearly ended the regiment before it had the chance to become famous. This is not a story about heroism, although there was plenty of it that night. It is a story about failure, specifically about exactly what went wrong, in what order, and why a unit built by capable, determined men still walked into a catastrophe on its very first attempt. Because almost nothing about Operation Squatter failed for a single, simple reason. It failed because a chain of separate decisions, each one defensible in isolation, combined into something none of them could survive alone. To understand what went wrong, you first need to understand what the plan assumed had to go right. By mid-1941, a young officer named David Sterling had convinced British Middle East headquarters to let him raise a small experimental raiding force, initially numbering around 60 men, many of them drawn from Lay Force, a commando formation being disbanded after losses elsewhere in the Mediterranean. The idea was simple in concept: parachute small teams into the desert at night near German and Italian airfields, march to the perimeter on foot, destroy as many parked aircraft as possible with hand-placed explosives, and then walk out to a rendezvous point in the desert, where a separate reconnaissance unit, the Long-Range Desert Group, would be waiting to drive them back to safety. Training took place at Cabrit, on the shores of the Great Bitter Lake, and it was fast, improvised, and thin on the kind of institutional experience that later SAS generations would take for granted. There was no earlier class of instructors to draw on because there was no earlier SAS. Men practiced live parachute descents with makeshift training methods, learned basic desert navigation, and rehearsed handling explosive charges, all in the space of a few months, under pressure to be ready in time for a major British offensive, Operation Crusader, that had already been scheduled. This is the first thing that went wrong, and it is easy to miss precisely because it isn't a single dramatic failure. The entire plan for Operation Squatter assumed a level of operational maturity the unit did not yet have time to develop. Every subsequent problem, the weather decision, the scattered drop, the soaked explosives, landed on a force that had almost no accumulated experience to fall back on when things stopped going according to plan. A more seasoned unit might have absorbed one or two of the failures that followed. L Detachment, on its first outing, had none of that margin. The second point of failure sat with the method of insertion itself, and specifically with the aircraft chosen to deliver it. 5 Bristol Bombay transport aircraft from the RAF's No. 216 Squadron were assigned to fly the raiding parties to their drop zones near the airfields at Gazala and Timimi. The Bombay was, by 1941 standards, already an aging design, a twin-engine transport originally intended as much for troop carrying and casualty evacuation as for precision parachute operations. It was slow, it offered limited navigational aids for finding a specific patch of open desert in total darkness, and it was vulnerable to both weather and enemy fighters. That vulnerability was not theoretical. During the operation itself, one of the 5 Bombays was shot down by enemy aircraft, killing everyone aboard 15 or more men, depending on the source, lost in a single stroke before they had even had the chance to jump. This wasn't a failure of courage or planning on the part of the men involved. It was a structural weakness baked into the choice of aircraft, and the fact that the RAF itself had, in the run-up to the mission, been reluctant to commit transport aircraft to what many senior officers still regarded as an unproven, faintly amateurish scheme dreamed up by a junior officer with no combat record in the theater. Sterling had needed to appeal above the heads of skeptical air commanders simply to secure the aircraft at all. and the aircraft he secured were not the ones best suited to the job, because better aircraft and a more enthusiastic RAF partnership simply weren't available to a unit nobody in the senior hierarchy fully believed in yet. The single most consequential failure of the entire operation, however, was a decision made hours before the aircraft ever left the ground, and it is the one point in the story where responsibility is unusually clear. In the days before the drop, an adverse weather forecast had already been raised as a concern. On the afternoon of 16 November, the Brigadier General Staff Coordinator overseeing the operation, Sandy Galloway, argued that the mission should be aborted outright. Dropping men by parachute at night, in the wind speeds being forecast, on a moonless night with no reliable visual reference for the pilots or the jumpers, was, in his professional judgment, hazardous in the extreme. Sterling was given the option to scrub the mission. He chose not to. According to accounts from men who were there, he asked his officers and men directly whether they wanted to proceed despite the forecast, and they answered to a man that they did. It is easy, looking back, to read this as simple courage, men who had trained for months, eager for the chance to prove a fledgling unit's worth, unwilling to let a forecast take that chance away from them. It is also, without much room for reinterpretation, the central operational error of the entire mission. The storm that struck that night was later described by survivors as one of the worst the region had experienced in 3 decades. High winds, driving rain, near-zero visibility, arriving at almost the exact moment the aircraft reached the drop zones. Every failure that followed can be traced back, in a very direct line, to the choice to fly into a forecast that had already been flagged as dangerous by the officer whose job it was to make exactly that call. It is worth being specific about what the mission was scattered by weather actually meant on the ground, because the phrase understates how completely the storm dismantled the plan. Parachutists jumping in high, gusting wind cannot control where they land relative to one another with anything like the precision a calm night allows. Men who had trained to descend together in tight sticks aimed at a specific patch of desert near a specific airfield, instead found themselves scattered across miles of open terrain, often alone or in pairs, with no way of knowing where the rest of their party had come down. Some were caught by the wind at the moment of landing and dragged violently across the rocky desert floor, unable to release their parachute harnesses quickly enough to stop themselves. One survivor later described the process of trying to unclip a parachute in those wind conditions as a job for Houdini. Injuries from these landings, before a single shot had been fired at the enemy, took some men out of the fight entirely. Separately from the men, the operation's equipment, explosives, weapons, and supplies had been dropped in its own containers, a standard practice for parachute operations of the period, intended to keep the fighting load light on the jump itself. In calm conditions, recovering these containers near the landing point was manageable. In a night storm that had already scattered the men themselves across a wide area, locating containers became close to impossible. Of roughly a dozen supply containers dropped that night, only a small handful were ever recovered. Many of the explosive charges that were found had been soaked through by the driving rain and rendered useless, precisely the equipment the entire mission depended on to destroy any aircraft at all. The result, in the operation's own after-action language, was a force widely dispersed, with its demolition material soaked. Not a single enemy aircraft was destroyed that night. The mission's central objective failed completely, not because the men who landed lacked the will to carry it out, but because the physical means of carrying it out, cohesive teams, working weapons, dry explosives, had been stripped away by the storm before those men ever reached an airfield perimeter. A less obvious failure, but one that compounded everything else, was what happened to the men once they were on the ground, scattered and alone, in hostile territory they had trained to cross only as part of a coordinated group. Small teams, and in some cases individual soldiers, now had to make their own way across open desert toward a rendezvous point where the long-range desert group was waiting. Without the navigational support, weapons, and manpower the operation had originally assumed they would have. Some men walked for more than 36 hours across exposed terrain, evading Axis patrols with minimal supplies, uncertain whether anyone else from their original party had survived the landing at all. This is where the absence of institutional experience mattered most. A unit with a longer operational history might have built in more robust individual survival and evasion training, better contingency planning for exactly this scenario, or simply a stronger shared understanding of how to behave when a mission collapsed into chaos. L Detachment, on its first outing, was largely improvising this part of the operation in real time, learning, at considerable personal risk to the men involved, lessons that later SAS training would treat as standard doctrine. Of the roughly 65 men who set out that night, only 22 eventually made it back to friendly lines. Others were killed in the confusion of the landing or in subsequent contact with the enemy. A number were captured and spent years in prisoner of war camps. At least 2 would not return home until they escaped captivity in October 1944, nearly 3 years after the mission that had put them there. It is tempting, when discussing Operation Squatter, to identify a single culprit: the weather, the decision to proceed, the aircraft, the inexperience of the unit, and treat that as the explanation. The more accurate picture is that the operation failed because several independent weaknesses were allowed to stack on top of one another, each one removing a layer of the margin that might otherwise have absorbed the others. An experienced unit might have survived a bad weather call by having better individual evasion training. Better aircraft might have reduced losses even in poor conditions. A less severe storm might have allowed even inexperienced men to stay together as planned. Any one of these factors, occurring alone, might well have produced a difficult but survivable mission. Instead, an untested unit, using aircraft that were already a marginal fit for the job, flew directly into one of the worst storms the region had seen in a generation, carrying men and equipment that had no built-in redundancy for exactly the kind of chaos that followed. This is, in a narrow sense, simply what operational failure often looks like in military history: not one single decisive error, but a sequence of individually explicable choices that happen to compound in the worst possible way, on the worst possible night, for a unit that had no accumulated experience to draw on when the compounding began. What makes Operation Squatter significant is not simply that it failed, but what the people responsible for it did with that failure afterward. And the honest accounting of what went wrong is the reason that response was possible at all. Sterling and the surviving officers did not conclude that the underlying concept behind the mission had been unsound. They concluded, correctly, that the specific method of getting men to their targets, a night parachute drop, at the mercy of weather no one could reliably forecast, with no fallback if conditions turned, was the single point of failure that had undone almost everything else. Barely a month later, a new operation built around long-range desert group trucks rather than parachutes struck 3 separate Axis airfields and destroyed dozens of enemy aircraft without losing a single man in the raiding parties themselves. That turnaround was only possible because the failures of the first mission had been identified with unusual clarity. Every weakness examined here: the immaturity of a newly formed unit, the marginal aircraft, the decision to fly against explicit warning, the total collapse of cohesion once the storm hit, the isolation of scattered survivors in hostile territory, pointed toward the same underlying lesson. The insertion method, not the raiding concept itself, was what needed to change. History remembers the special air service for the raids that followed, the ones that worked. But the accurate, unflinching answer to what went wrong on its first attempt is what actually made those later successes possible. Operation Squatter failed because an inexperienced unit, flying in aircraft already stretched beyond their ideal role, launched into a forecast storm on a moonless night and had no institutional depth to absorb what happened when nearly everything that could go wrong did. Recognizing that, honestly and specifically, in the weeks that followed, is the reason the regiment survived its own beginning.